There was once a man named Daniel, a dreamer caught in the endless trap of talking about what he wanted to do, but never quite stepping forward to do it. Every morning, Daniel would wake with grand ideas bursting in his mind. Ambitions to start a business, to write a book, to transform his life. Yet by nightfall, these ideas remained just words spoken aloud, fading into the silent shadows of inaction. Daniel was a master of conversation, able to paint vivid pictures with his speech, inspiring friends and family, yet his life felt stuck, weighed down by the heavy burden of unfulfilled promises he made mostly to himself. One crisp autumn day, after yet another evening spent narrating plans without progress, Daniel crossed paths with an old man named Samuel. Samuel was a quiet, steady presence in the town, a man whose reputation wasn't built on what he said, but what he did. His neighbors admired him not for his speeches or grand declarations, but for the fruits of his labor, a flourishing garden that fed many, a sturdy home built with his own hands, and a calm, unshakable wisdom in his eyes. Daniel, frustrated and desperate for change, approached Samuel and asked him the secret behind his success. Samuel smiled gently and said, "I speak less because I do more. Words are easy to say, but they weigh nothing. It is the work behind the words that carries weight, that builds reality." Daniel listened, intrigued but skeptical. "How do I stop talking and start doing?" he asked. Samuel's reply was simple. Begin small, begin now, and let your actions speak louder than your voice. That night, Daniel sat alone with his thoughts, the echo of Samuel's words ringing in his ears. He realized that for years he had been filling the space with noise, plans, excuses, and distractions, but never making the first step. Inspired but uncertain, Daniel decided to change. The next morning, he didn't announce his plans to the world. He simply began. He wrote a single page of his book, made one phone call for his business idea, and took a brisk walk to clear his mind. These small acts, though seemingly insignificant, became the foundation for something greater. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's new practice of silent action transformed his life. His friends noticed the change, less chatter, more visible progress. His energy shifted from the restless, scattered buzz of ideas to the focused, steady momentum of real work. Each step forward was a lesson in humility and patience, teaching Daniel that true power lies not in how loudly one can speak, but in how consistently one can move forward. One evening, Daniel sat with Samuel again, sharing the subtle but profound changes in his life. Samuel nodded with quiet approval and said, "The world is filled with dreamers who talk endlessly, but those who build the future are those who choose to do. Speak less, do more. That is the path to mastery and fulfillment." Daniel carried this truth close to his heart. He came to understand that action isn't about rushing or reckless movement, but about disciplined, purposeful steps taken every day. It's about cutting through the noise of doubt, fear, and distraction to focus on the work that matters. And in doing so, Daniel's life became a testament to the power of silent dedication, a story not told in words, but in results. His transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it ever easy. There were days of struggle and moments of doubt. But each time he was tempted to speak more than act, Daniel reminded himself of Samuel's wisdom. He learned to embrace the uncomfortable silence that comes before progress, to value effort over empty promises, and to let his actions speak so loudly that words were no longer needed to prove his worth. In the end, Daniel's journey is a lesson for all of us. We live in a world that celebrates loud voices and quick talk, but the real game changers are those who choose discipline over distraction, substance over noise, and action over excuses. When you speak less and do more, you reclaim your power. You stop waiting for the perfect moment or the right audience and start creating the life you desire through consistent effort. So, ask yourself, what is it you've been saying without doing? What dreams have you talked about but never touched? The truth is, no one else can build your vision for you. The only way forward is through action, steady and true. Let your work be your loudest voice. Be the person who builds quietly, who moves with purpose, who achieves not through words, but through relentless doing. Remember, every great success story began with someone who stopped talking and started acting. Your time is now. Speak less, do more, and watch as your life transforms from a collection of empty promises into a legacy of accomplishment and fulfillment. As the months passed, Daniel's quiet discipline began to ripple outward in ways he never expected. Without seeking praise or recognition, people began noticing. They started asking how he had changed, not just in the way he worked, but in how he carried himself. There was a quiet confidence in his posture now, a steadiness in his voice. He no longer needed to convince anyone of his dreams. His results were beginning to speak for him, subtly, yet powerfully. He wasn't rich yet. He wasn't famous. But he was fulfilled in a way that success alone couldn't explain. He had discovered the rare freedom that comes from honoring your own word through consistent effort. He no longer felt like a prisoner of potential. He was living it. And through the daily rhythm of quiet work, he had built a kind of internal wealth no one could take away from him's self-respect. The temptation to talk about the future still came, especially when others gathered to share their big goals, their next big things. But Daniel had learned. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice unless asked. He simply nodded, smiled, and then got back to his work. He had discovered a truth that changed everything. That most people aren't looking for advice. They're looking for someone who lives the advice. And that's what he had become. He had once thought that silence was weakness. Now he knew silence was strength. It was control. It was the decision to protect your energy from the noise of empty intentions and direct it instead into quiet execution. And the more he practiced this, the more focused he became. With each passing day, he grew more committed to the process, not the applause. He understood now what Jim Rohn meant when he said, "Don't just read the easy stuff. You may be entertained by it, but you will never grow from it." Daniel began surrounding himself with people who also valued action over talk. Their conversations were different. They asked better questions. What did you build today? Where did you fail? What did you learn? These weren't surface-level exchanges. They were the honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversations of people who were shaping themselves into something real. And Daniel thrived in this environment. It was no longer about motivation. It was about maturity, real growth, real responsibility. There came a time years later when Daniel was asked to speak at a local event, not because he had asked, but because others insisted. "Come," they said, "tell your story, inspire others." At first, he resisted. He wasn't a speaker. He was a doer. But eventually, he agreed not to impress, but to share. And when he stood before the crowd, he didn't talk about overnight success or viral shortcuts. He talked about the mornings he didn't feel like working but did anyway. He talked about the discipline of showing up, the failures that taught him more than wins, the silence that forged his strength. He spoke only for 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes landed harder than any hour-long seminar because it was backed by years of action. He didn't speak to sound wise. He spoke to share truth. And when he finished, there was no thunderous applause, just a quiet respect. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Others sat still, absorbing every word, because what he said wasn't loud, but it was real. And that was Daniel's legacy. Not the things he owned, not the posts he shared, not the dreams he boasted about, but the example he became. He was proof that the quiet man with a shovel can build more than the loud man with a microphone. He was the reminder that the world doesn't need more talkers. It needs more doers. And he chose every day to be one. So if you find yourself stuck in that cycle, dreaming, planning, talking, but not moving, remember Daniel. Remember that real transformation doesn't begin with big announcements. It begins in silence, in that small, private decision to take the first step, and then another, and then another. Not for the world to see, but for yourself. Because you're tired of the sound of your own excuses. Because you're ready to earn your peace, your progress, your purpose through action. Speak less. Do more. Let that be your code. Let that be your rebellion in a world addicted to noise. Let your work be your sermon, your resume, your revolution. Because when you become the one who does instead of just says, you don't just change your life. You become the kind of person who can change the world. Years passed. The seasons came and went, and with them, Daniel aged. His hair grayed, his pace slowed, but his discipline never wavered. His days remained filled with purpose, not noise. In his quiet home on the edge of town, he would rise before the sun, not because he had to anymore, but because it was who he had become. It was never about chasing success. It was about honoring a standard, a rhythm, a way of life forged in silence and solidified through action. He no longer needed reminders or motivation. He had long since crossed the bridge where discipline replaced desire, where the work itself was the reward. There was no struggle to begin anymore. The resistance that once kept him talking instead of doing was gone, burned away by years of consistency. And in that silence, in that structure, Daniel found something most people spend their whole lives chasing: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from escaping work, but the kind that comes from embracing it. The kind of peace that lives inside a man who knows he gave his all, who doesn't need to prove himself to anyone, who can sit alone in a room with his thoughts and feel no shame, because he became the man he said he would be. He often thought of Samuel, the old man who changed his life with a single sentence: speak less, do more. It echoed through every year, every project, every breakthrough. Samuel had long passed on, but his wisdom lived in Daniel's actions. And now others came to Daniel, younger men and women seeking guidance, not for answers, but for example, because the world was still loud, still cluttered with talkers and critics and distractions. But Daniel had become a rare thing, a man whose presence was a lesson, a man whose actions whispered louder than most people's shouts. And he would tell them if they asked. He would tell them the truth, not sugar-coated or softened. Discipline is quiet, he'd say. Progress is slow. But if you're willing to trade your excuses for action, your noise for movement, your talk for truth, you'll build something nobody can take from you. A reputation, a body of work, a life that speaks for itself. He didn't offer shortcuts. He didn't promise miracles. He offered something stronger: responsibility, ownership, the power to change through simple, consistent doing. In his final years, Daniel sat by the same window each morning, sipping his coffee, watching the sunrise like it was the first time. And in those moments, there was no regret, no missed opportunity, no unfinished business, because he had lived fully, not loudly, but deeply. And when his time came, the town didn't mourn with noise. They honored him with silence, with quiet respect, with stories of how he showed up, stayed true, and never let the noise of the world drown out the voice of his work. Daniel's legacy wasn't carved into statues or plastered across screens. It lived in the people he inspired by example: the young man who finally started his business, the mother who began writing her book at dawn, the teenager who stopped boosting and started building. Daniel's influence spread not because he said the right words, but because he became the right kind of man. And now it's your turn. This isn't just Daniel's story. It's the story of every person who chooses to trade talk for truth, who wakes up one morning and says, enough, I'm done waiting, I'm done performing, I'm ready to do. It's the story of the quiet ones, the disciplined ones, the ones who don't need applause because they've already earned their own respect. It's your story if you're willing to live it. So what will you do today? Will you scroll a little longer? Talk a little louder? Or will you begin, even if no one's watching, to shape the life you've been speaking of for years? The answers aren't in the noise, they're in the work. Remember this: the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. The most powerful voice is the one backed by a body of work, a disciplined life, and a quiet resolve to keep going even when no one claps. Be that voice. Speak less, do more. And let your legacy write itself, one silent victory at a time. Time, that quiet sculptor of all things, eventually takes everything. But it cannot touch what is eternal. Not wealth, not fame, but impact. And Daniel's impact lived on, not in speeches replayed, but in silent action repeated by those he quietly influenced. His life became a ripple, not a crashing wave, but a steady current that pulled others toward purpose. Because when a man lives by example, he doesn't just influence, he awakens. He reminds others what's possible when ego is put aside, when words are put down, and hands are put to work. Long after he was gone, the stories still lived, of how Daniel never missed a day of work on his dream, of how he gave without boasting, listened more than he spoke, and made people feel seen without trying to be seen himself. His journals were later found, filled not with poetry or philosophy, but with lists of actions taken, lessons learned, ideas started, and projects finished. No fluff, no rambling, Just raw, unfiltered doing. Page after page of silent victories. And isn't that what we all want? To know that our days weren't wasted in chatter, but spent in creation. That our lives weren't defined by what we said we'd do, but by what we built, brick by brick, even when no one believed in us. That's the gift of a quiet life of purpose. No spotlight, no applause, but full satisfaction when you lay your head down each night. Because you didn't just think, you didn't just wish, you did. That's the call in front of you now. Not tomorrow, not when you're more motivated. Now, get up and start. Start before you feel ready. Start even if no one believes in you. Start especially when no one is watching. Because those are the hours that count the most. The hours that forge character. The hours where the real work begins. You'll be tempted to speak again, to announce what's coming, to prove yourself too early. Don't let the others talk. Let them chase approval. You stay quiet. Stay focused. Let your success be the noise. Let your consistency be the proof. Let your work speak languages your mouth never could. Speak less. And keep doing until silence surrounds you. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything has already been said through what you've built. And when that day comes, when the world finally asks how you did it, you won't need to raise your voice. You'll just smile, because they'll already know.